When Symbol Becomes Proof, Part 3, Headless Transgression, Black Magic or Abject Art. Welcome or welcome back to this series wherein I respond to a video I viewed here on YouTube from the channel Izzy regarding the occult rituals and Baal worship of designers and artists Rick Owens, Michèle Lamy, and CHRISTEENE. This series will be available for YouTube and Patreon members as early access content. If you haven't watched the first two parts yet, please check out the links in the description box to get caught up. This series is examining how claims about the occult are constructed, presented, and interpreted, particularly when they're offered as historical or religious fact. The guiding question here is, what happens to meaning when symbols are removed from their contexts and treated as evidence? A disclaimer, this isn't a pejorative attack on the content creator Izzy. I'm simply looking more closely at the claims in the original video and showing how we can interpret these through a different lens. If you appreciate this type of content, please give this video a like and consider subscribing or becoming a member if you're serious about supporting my work in that way. In part 2, we looked at the specific mechanics of Aleister Crowley's theurgy, a disciplined, goal-oriented practice aimed at spiritual evolution of one's true will. We saw how later practitioners like Kenneth Grant shifted focus toward ecstatic exhaustion and biological shortcuts to reach the night side of consciousness. We ended with a vital distinction. While the occultist uses the body as a symbolic vehicle to reach the divine through ritual, Owens, Lamy, and CHRISTEENE are seemingly using transgression to challenge social boundaries. This video will be addressing this and much more. Before we look at the video, however, I want to address the Satanic label used in the transcript. There is a massive irony here, and it has to do with the gap between the pop culture and religious definition of black magic and the esoteric Crowleyan definition of it. If we look at Chapter 21 of Magic in Theory and Practice, Crowley defined black magic as any operation that deviates from the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. Now, black magic, in the general understanding of the term, is a system of sorcery that relies on making pacts with or worshiping malevolent entities, Satan, the devil, demons, etc., to achieve worldly gain. Crowley is often mistakenly labeled as being a Satanist, but by Crowley's own definition, if someone is simply sneering at creation or acting out of lust without a divine telos or goal, they aren't performing his magic. They are a black brother in his terms, the very thing his headless ritual was designed to prevent. By Crowley's own rigid standards, if Rick Owens is simply mocking moralism or beauty standards, he isn't performing an occult ritual. He is engaging in a secular, non-magical protest. Recall that Owens himself has stated clearly, quote, "I don't believe in Satan. Come on," end quote. If there is no Satan in Owens' worldview, then there is no satanic energy to harness. The transgression isn't spiritual, it's social. However, Crowley also goes on to say in Chapter 21 that, quote, "The devil does not exist. It is a false name invented by the Black Brothers to imply a unity in their ignorant muddle of dispersions. A devil who had unity would be a god," end quote. So what does this mean? Crowley's statement that the devil does not exist is rooted in his monistic, non-dualistic, or unitary view of the universe. Crowley argues that the devil is a false name used to give a sense of unity to things that are actually just dispersions or chaotic, uncoordinated forces. In Thelema, unity is the hallmark of the divine. If a devil truly possessed a unified will or a centralized existence, that entity would, by definition, be a god. For Crowley, what people call the devil is usually just a projection of their own ignorant muddle, the parts of their psyche that are not yet aligned with their true will. So, who are these Black Brothers? Crowley adapted the term Black Brothers and the Black Lodge as well from theosophical concepts of the Great White Brotherhood, but he gave it a specific initiatory meaning within Thelema. In Crowley's grade system, when an adept reaches the grade of Magister Templi, they must cross the abyss. This requires the destruction of the ego by figuratively pouring every drop of one's blood into the cup of Babylon. Babylon represents the universal matrix or the Great Mother. To pour your blood into the cup is a symbolic way of saying that you are surrendering your entire individual identity, your ego, your history, your personality, so that it can be dissolved into the universe. It is the ultimate act of spiritual trust. You give up being a someone to become part of the all. The Black Brother is simply the one who gets to the edge of the abyss and refuses to let go. Crossing the abyss is the most critical obstacle in this path, and the Cup of Babylon is the goal. The irony of the quote-unquote satanic conspiracy narrative is that it describes people who are obsessed with their own power and ego, the very definition of those who fail to cross. A Black Brother in this context is an initiate of the left-hand path, defined in Crowley's system as someone who refuses to surrender their ego. They attempt to shut themselves up and maintain their individual personality rather than merging with the universal. And we'll return to this concept of the left-hand path later on, as this term is used differently now by occultists. Crowley's analysis of black magic is essentially a critique of selfishness and lack of focus. He defines it as any act that is not directed towards the great work or spiritual union. Going back to the original video I'm critiquing, this highlights a major flaw in Izzy's logic, in my opinion. He suggests that the occult, as it were, is organized and plotting with its, quote, aims at distorting creation, end quote. Crowley's point is that black forces are, by their very nature, disorganized and incapable of unity. So let's unpack this a bit more and get into the mechanical logics of Crowley's system and of spiritual warfare narratives. Usually, the satanic or the occult, as Izzy is depicting it, is presented as a highly organized, unified group working towards a singular goal. Crowley's philosophy argues that this is a logical contradiction. If we look into his deeper initiatory texts like The Vision and the Voice, Crowley taught that the definition of a god or a master is unity. To achieve anything significant in his system, a person must align all parts of their psyche into a single true will. Crowley defined the black magician as someone who refuses to unify their will with the universe. They cling to their ego, which is naturally fragmented, chaotic, and dried up by isolation. Because black practitioners are driven by individual ego and selfish desire, they cannot truly cooperate. According to Crowley, they are too busy fighting for their own individual power to ever form a unified satanic front. They are a danger not because they are powerful villains, but because they are parasitic and stagnant. They are more like energy vampires who confuse and drain the spiritual progress of others. Crowley argues that the devil is just a name people use to try to give a face to this chaotic mess. By calling it satanic, the conspiracy theorist is accidentally giving the artists more credit and power than even an occultist would. You can't have it both ways. Either these artists are following Crowley's disciplined path, which rejects the idea of a devil, or they are Black brothers who are too disorganized to be a threat. If the artists are followers of Crowley, they don't believe in the devil. If they are Black magicians, they are not followers of Crowley, as he rejects these failed initiates. Now, people often get stuck here. If Crowley says the devil doesn't exist, how can his Black brothers be Satanists? The answer is, they aren't. In Crowley's world, Black magic isn't about worshiping a demon. It's about a refusal to grow up spiritually. It's about clinging to your own ego like a dried up husk instead of joining the flow of the universe. So, when we see a narrator like Izzy calling this a sex magic ritual, which would be equated to being a satanic thing, they are misapplying the term twice. They are calling it satanic, which Crowley rejects, and organized, which Black magic, by his definition, can't be. They've built a monster out of terms that actually describe a lack of power, not an abundance of it. By the way, if you'd like a more in-depth look at the concepts of the Great White Brotherhood and the Black Lodge, which has its own backstory, and how these ideas influenced Mark Frost and David Lynch's idea of the Black Lodge as seen in Twin Peaks, let me know in the comments. It's too much of a tangent to get into here, but I'd be super happy to make a separate video for it, as it's a perfect example of occulture. Now, let's move on to the term transgressive. At the end of part 2, I mentioned that I thought what was really going on with the butt muscle video was artistic transgression. But again, we need to look at how the term is being used in different contexts, as its meaning depends entirely on the intent of the person using it. For the occultist, transgression is antinomianism, or the deliberate breaking of social taboos to shatter the ego's conditioning. The goal is to reach a state of equanimity where the pure and impure are seen as one. For the artist, transgression is a discursive tool used to challenge aesthetic standards. Artists use shameful or dirty imagery to strip away the social mask and force the viewer to confront the biological reality of being human. The difference? One is a personal, mostly solitary trial of one's soul meant for spiritual gain. The other is a public broadcast meant to disrupt the viewer's comfort. Granted, the two could be used in tandem if the artist is also an occultist, but that's what we're trying to determine here. Another term I need to introduce at this point is abjection. It's often used with transgression, so let's look more closely at this too. While both concepts deal with breaking rules and crossing lines, they come from entirely different intellectual traditions and describe completely different psychological and social experiences. Think of it this way. Transgression is a conscious act of stepping over a boundary, while abjection is the gut-wrenching feeling of a boundary collapsing entirely. Transgression comes from sociology, literary theory, and philosophy. It is fundamentally about rules, laws, and boundaries. It often carries a sense of rebellion, defiance, thrill, or political protest. It is an action directed at an external authority. Abjection comes from psychoanalysis and literary theory, most famously defined by Julia Kristeva in her essay, Powers of Horror. It's not about laws, it is about identity, clean boundaries, and survival. When we encounter the abject, our immediate reaction is deep revulsion. It is our psyche frantically trying to eject something to protect its own boundaries. One feels visceral horror, disgust, existential dread, and psychological discomfort. It isn't a rebellious choice, it's an involuntary reaction to a threat to your identity. Returning now to the concept of the left-hand path that I mentioned earlier, for the left-hand path occultist, transgression is an active, calculated, and highly ritualized weapon. They do not break taboos just to be edgy. They break them to shatter the mundane ego and free themselves from societal programming. The occultist identifies a rigid boundary, whether it is a cultural taboo or a personal phobia, and deliberately steps over it. Transgression requires intense agency and willpower, and it is a conscious no to the established order, which is, by the way, what the right-hand path would be following. But that's a story for another day. If transgression is the act of opening a forbidden door, abjection is the monster waiting on the other side of it. Abjection is the psychological breakdown the magician experiences when they confront something that thoroughly disgusts or unmasks them. When the left-hand path practitioner deliberately breaks a profound taboo, they don't just break a rule, they trigger a primal biological crisis of existential dread. The psyche screams that its boundary between the self and the other is dissolving. Unlike transgression, you cannot will your way through abjection. It is an involuntary somatic reaction, such as nausea, terror, or the urge to flee. The distinct difference in the occult method is that transgression is the action, while abjection is the psychological state being mastered. A regular mainstream person encounters the abject by accident and flees from it to keep their ego intact. A right-hand path practitioner avoids the abject by strictly following the established rules of their belief system. The left-hand path practitioner uses transgression to dive directly into the abject on purpose. One example of an occultist and artist in this methodology is Genesis P-Orridge. P-Orridge was co-founder of the Temple of Psychic Youth, or TOPY, in 1981. This was an informal order heavily rooted in chaos magic, localized ritual, and the manipulation of the human psyche. P-Orridge, Peter Christopherson, both formerly from the band Throbbing Gristle, and Alex Ferguson established this group alongside the launch of their multimedia and experimental music project called Psychic TV. For P-Orridge, art and magic were completely inseparable. Early in their career with the collective COUM transmissions, P-Orridge used extreme transgression. Their infamous 1976 prostitution show at London's Institute of Contemporary Arts featured used tampons, pornography, and imagery of serial killers. This wasn't merely shock value. In line with chaos magic, it was a deliberate demolition of social programming, or the control machine, to rupture ordinary consciousness. Modern chaos magicians often use abject imagery to reach a state of gnosis through exhaustion or disgust. For example, in the works of Phil Hine, there is a focus on shattering the image. If you can stand in the middle of a chaotic, jarring sexual environment and remain focused on a magical intent, you have conquered your animalistic flinch response. P-Orridge's later Pandrogyny project with partner Lady J is the ultimate example of mastering the abject. They underwent matching plastic surgeries to merge their identities into a single third gender entity. In Kristeva's terms, they aggressively attacked the most fundamental human boundary, the individual identity of the singular body. By destabilizing the line between me and you, they transformed the horror of losing the self into a sacred, alchemical act of creation. Now, let's shift focus to look at how transgression and abjection is used in art performance, taking CHRISTEENE and the butt muscle video as our example. When performance art utilizes these themes, transgression is used as a political and social weapon, while abjection is used as a somatic or bodily and existential commentary. In this particular video, transgression is a calculated, conscious raid on the boundaries of polite society, capitalism, and heteronormativity. Because CHRISTEENE is collaborating with Rick Owens and Michèle Lamy, the transgression is deeply systemic. It injects raw, gutter-level, queer hostility directly into the pristine, hyper-commodified world of luxury art and fashion. The transgression here is highly conceptual. It intentionally violates the boundaries of good taste, respectability politics, and commercial viability. CHRISTEENE's performance aggressively parodies and breaks social taboos surrounding queer sexuality, body presentation, and commercial aesthetics. By featuring Owens and Lamy, who represent a specific tier of elite cultural capitalism, the video acts as an institutional transgression. It forces the high fashion and art world to look at, host, and legitimize a feral, deeply unsanitized expression of the body. Through its confrontation and defiance, it liberates. The transgression is an active FU to societal expectations of what a queer body or an art piece should look like. While the transgression is political, the abjection is biological and psychological. CHRISTEENE's entire aesthetic is built on Julia Kristeva's definition of the abject, the breakdown of the clean, sealed, proper human body. Kristeva writes that the abject is what disturbs identity, system, and order. CHRISTEENE achieves this by weaponizing the leaking body. Christine Alicette Vale, or CHRISTEENE, is the stage name of Paul Soileau, an American performance artist and singer-songwriter. CHRISTEENE is noted for untraditional, quote-unquote, terrorist drag, which features her wearing torn-up clothing, stringy, matted black wigs, and heavy, smeared makeup with aims to expose hypocrisy and intolerance. When asked where the inspiration for CHRISTEENE came from, Soileau said in a Westward article from 2012, quote, "It was just a really nice alignment of a lot of different things going on inside me and in my environment. I do another character that you could call more of a traditional character in the lineage of a Dame Edna persona, like an everyone's favorite grandma type. Her name is Rebecca Havemeyer, and it's all makeup, wig, and heels. Very pretty and fun." When CHRISTEENE came out of me, I was searching for something that had the action of a switchblade in my pocket, a character I could really put on quickly but affect people in a much stronger way. Something strong enough to channel things inside me that needed to come out, more aggressive things. When everything aligned properly, CHRISTEENE kind of just appeared. I found a wig and went to town. It's just that when it's on stage, you see the flip side of CHRISTEENE. It's very aggressive and very raw. It harkens back to more of a punk thing, like you're watching a punk show. I would never call it a drag show." End quote. In a 2017 article by Out.com, Michael Rulli writes, quote, "Butt muscle is CHRISTEENE's declaration of shame-free queer intimacy." Paul, as CHRISTEENE, said, quote, "There was a strong conversation that," the director Matt Lambert, "brought to the table about finding real intimacy within these very loud capitalized actions of sexuality that people like to plaster on front pages. I think we found that together in the video, and that's why it's so very real. We were personally, humanly, and spiritually enjoying these moments, and we had someone behind the camera that knew how to capture the intimacy of all that and not exploit it." End quote. So when looking at the video through the lens of abjection, we see that it bypasses the viewer's intellectual politics and triggers an immediate involuntary somatic response. And this could be disgust, discomfort, or fascination. It forces the viewer to confront the messy, wet reality of human anatomy that society spends billions of dollars trying to hide via makeup, hygiene products, and tailored clothes. CHRISTEENE's physical presentation in the video of smeared makeup, exposed bodily fluids, matted hair, distorted postures, and an emphasis on genitalia violates the boundary of the clean and proper self. The video strips away the sanitized, clinical version of sex and replaces it with the fleshy reality of the body. It forces a confrontation with what Kristeva calls, quote, "the boundary that has become an object," end quote. That in the video is flesh, sweat, and mucous membranes. As Style Zeitgeist featured in 2017, quote, "the video featured Owens and his partner Michèle Lamy doing what they do best, terrorizing accepted aesthetic and sexual norms," end quote. Their intent is to shatter psychological denial. By forcing the viewer into a state of abjection, CHRISTEENE tears down the illusion that we are dignified, orderly beings separate from nature. It reminds the audience that beneath our expensive clothes, even Rick Owens' clothes, we are just leaking processed meat. However, this music video has another message. Director Matt Lambert said, quote, "At their core, really, it's about intimacy, humanity, and trust in someone else. So far, the only hope for me was that we could have these types of conversations, that people wouldn't reduce it to that Rick Owens video where he gets pissed on the face. We need to use those moments and symbols as a point to discuss intimacy of queer bodies and sexual politics. So far this week, I've had a lot of conversations, and in these dialogues, people's opinions have been evolving. Even if it's a small audience, there's a shift in that," end quote. Pointing out here that, unfortunately, Izzy did exactly what the director feared. He reduced a complex commentary on intimacy down to a base, literist, even satanic shock tactic. But back to transgression and abjection and how they work together. In a performance like Butt Muscle, transgression and abjection work in a tag team dynamic to achieve a specific artistic goal. Transgression gets you through the door. It is the vehicle that allows CHRISTEENE to invade high fashion spaces, use Owens' platform, and break cultural laws of respectability. It engages the viewer's intellect and political stance. Abjection drops the floor out from under you. Once the viewer is watching, the abject aesthetics bypass the intellect and hit them in the gut. You can intellectually support the political transgression of queer art, but you could still find yourself experiencing the visceral discomfort of abjection when confronted with the raw, fluid reality of the performance. What did Rick Owens say about the video? In the article from Women's Wear Daily, Rick Owens says hardcore video represents cheerful degeneracy from January 30th. 2017 by Robert Williams, quote, "For Rick Owens, making a hardcore music video with self-described drag terrorist Christine Vale isn't just about shock value. It's about tolerance, kindness, and balancing out what the designer sees as rising bigotry and cruelty in society." Quoting Owens, "If we have extreme self-righteous bigotry on one side, then we need to balance that out with some cheerful degeneracy on the other," end quote. For Owens, the underground may no longer be possible, but the importance of counterculture is rising. Sometimes there are social and political climates that people want to react against, and this could be one of those moments. It has to be one of those moments, he said. Fetishes have long been a motif in Rick Owens' work. A statue he displayed at Pitti Uomo in 2011 showed him peeing onto mirrors. The designer likes to ask why certain themes, notably sexual ones, are still seen as perverse while violence and cruelty are so broadly accepted. End quote. This is why the artist chose to use transgression and abjection, to show the audience this hypocrisy, and on the flip side, to show the playfulness of their song. Continuing with the article, quote, Owens said the video was partly about having fun with friends. He noted he and his wife and business partner, Michèle Lamy, had a ridiculous bonding experience shooting the video with Vail and director Matt Lambert, and gained greater self-awareness. But it's also about making use of his platform's independence. About the more graphic sexual acts depicted in the video, it's kind of like watching someone from another planet do things their way, and there's something to be said for an attitude for tolerance for that, Owens said. Putting out positive energy is an opportunity I have that I don't want to waste. Sure, it has shock value, and shock value is fun, but fundamentally it's about kindness and self-awareness and tolerance. End quote. With regard to Izzy's commentary on why Michèle Lamy was dressed as an angel in the video, seen in the transcript at 12:05, quote, it is to destroy and distort creation and to make it ugly because Satan cannot create. It can only disrupt, distort, uglify, and sneer in the face of creation. And that is the point of Michèle Lamy, aka the High Priestess of Paris, dressing up like an angel and being floated around the video is to represent as well. It is to sneer in the face of the angelic into the divine. End quote. However, when looking to Owens' own words about his feelings for his partner, Michèle, this is what we find. In an article from Marie Claire France, Rick Owens, Prince of Anti-Fashion, August 2025, by Charlotte Brunel, quote, in the early 80s, he studied fashion at Otis College in Los Angeles while gravitating toward the alternative scene on Hollywood Boulevard. There, he meets the French artist and model Michèle Lamy. With her extravagant style, she was developing her own label at the time. Lamy hired Owens to design her men's line. From the start, their connection was undeniable. When Owens launched his own brand in 1994, Lamy became his partner in business and in life, muse, collaborator, and guardian angel. End quote. Viewing Michèle Lamy dressed as an angel through a satanic panic lens, one would assume it's a mockery or a sinister inversion. But this completely ignores Owens' actual relationship with religious iconography. As mentioned before, Owens went to a private Catholic high school. He has openly discussed how spending his days studying morality and his nights looking at grand old Hollywood black and white interpretations of the Bible is exactly what formed his aesthetic language. For Owens, these symbols aren't weapons used to scare people. They are grand, dramatic archetypes of beauty, kindness, and protection. Placing Lamy in the video as an angel isn't an occult symbol. It's a literal manifestation of how he views her role in his life. A stabilizing, loving presence sitting right in the middle of their shared, sometimes chaotic, punk rock world. Now that we have dissected and compared the vocabulary, we can finally circle back to Izzy's central accusation. His claim that the butt muscle video is a literal sex magic ritual identical to the practices of Aleister Crowley. When you look at the actual evidence, this claim falls apart on three distinct levels, in my opinion. Historical fact, practical mechanics, and artistic intent. As we established earlier in this series, the conspiracy narrative relies on a misunderstood timeline of Crowley's life. Izzy claims that Crowley was performing sex magic rituals in Egypt in 1904 during the reception of the Book of the Law. But, as I have shown in parts 1 and 2, Crowley wasn't practicing sex magic in Egypt. He didn't even integrate sex into his magical system until years later. Next, we examined the mechanical goals of these practices. The ceremonial magician uses sex as a closed-loop system of supreme focus. Whether working alone or with a partner, the goal of sex magic in Thelema is to channel the intense energy of orgasm towards a single hyper-focused spiritual intent, the great work, or the alignment with the true will. It is an intensely disciplined act of psychological concentration. The transgressive performance artist, as we just saw with CHRISTEENE, Owens, and Lamy, is doing the exact opposite. They are not in a private space directing internal energy towards a spiritual plane. They are broadcasting raw, chaotic, and destabilizing imagery to a public audience. One is an act of internal focus meant to transcend the physical world. The other is a public disruption meant to force the viewer to confront the physical world. They are completely different human behaviors. Lastly, for something to be a Crowleyan sex magic ritual, it requires an occult telos, a conscious magical objective or goal aligned with his system of Thelema. But as we read straight from the primary sources, look at what the creators of Butt Muscle actually say they are doing. Rick Owens explicitly states he doesn't believe in Satan and calls the video an act of cheerful degeneracy to balance out societal bigotry and to promote tolerance. Director Matt Lambert explicitly stated the video is a commentary on queer intimacy and sexual politics, begging audiences not to reduce it to a mere shock tactic. And Paul Swallow, as CHRISTEENE, explicitly compares the energy of the performance to a punk rock show designed to be a switchblade against social hypocrisy. So, when Izzy points to the Butt Muscle video and says, "This is sex magic," he is making a massive error, in my opinion. He is taking public, punk rock, anti-heteronormative performance art, which uses transgressive aesthetics and biological abjection to spark social commentary, and he's mislabeling it as a secretive, esoteric spiritual ritual. By ignoring the artist's explicit intentions, the history of Crowley's actual practices, and the fundamental mechanics of how magic operates, this conspiracy narrative creates a terrifying phantom. But when we look at this through the light of actual research, the phantom vanishes, leaving behind exactly what the artists promised: raw, challenging, and intensely human art. Now, there's one more thing I'd like to circle back to. Remember the Headless ritual I mentioned back in part 2? This central visual motif is also worth examining, as it provides the link that we need to fully understand what's going on. We already examined Aleister Crowley's bornless or headless ritual in Egypt, but there's another highly influential person in art history who also addresses headlessness: the French philosopher Georges Bataille and his secret society, Acéphale. To understand why this matters, we have to trace the historical lineage of the Headless, because it is the precursor to Julia Kristeva's theory of abjection that we just broke down. First, let's look at the mechanical difference between Crowley's occult headless and Bataille's philosophical headless. Recall, in Crowley's Thelema, the headless one is an adaptation of an ancient Egyptian exorcism fragment. For Crowley, headless is taken from acéphalos, The goal of Crowley's ritual is ascension and divine authority. You shed your human limitations to become a sovereign god. But later, in 1936, Georges Bataille formed a secret society and a review called Acéphale, which is the French for Headless. The emblem of the society, drawn by artist André Masson, was a man with his head chopped off, his groin covered by a skull, holding a dagger and a burning heart. But Bataille's goal wasn't Crowley's occult ascension, it was the exact opposite. It was radical descension. For Bataille, the human head represents the tyrant of the body. It represents cold rationality, science, the state, the church, and patriarchal authority. The head is what tells us to be productive and to follow the rules of society. By celebrating the headless body, Bataille was calling for a rebellion and argued that true liberation happens when we escape the head and descend into our stomach, our genitals, our passions, and our fluids. To Bataille, the headless man represents a human being who has escaped the cage of civilization. This is where the direct historical link to Julia Kristeva comes in. In 1934, Bataille published an essay called Abjection and Miserable Forms, where he argued that society maintains its clean, orderly power by violently casting out and excluding anything it deems dirty or low. 50 years later, Julia Kristeva took Bataille's concept of social exclusion, mixed it with psychoanalysis, and gave us the modern definition of the abject, the visceral horror we feel when the tidy boundaries of our identity collapse. So, when we look at the butt muscle video, we are seeing a direct, uninterrupted lineage of secular avant-garde art. Bataille says, let's chop off the head of respectability and celebrate the raw, lower functions of the body. Kristeva says, when you do that, it will trigger a biological state of gut-wrenching objection. CHRISTEENE and Owens say, exactly. We are going to use that headless, abject energy to shock you out of your political and aesthetic complacency. The ultimate irony in all of this is that Crowley used the headless motif as an act of supreme spiritual ascension, shedding human limitations to claim the ultimate authority of a sovereign god. Bataille and modern performance artists use the headless motif for the exact opposite, radical material descension, demolishing the rational mind to reject all authority and celebrate our raw bodily reality. But the conspiracy narrative looks at a proud tradition of transgressive French philosophy and surrealist art, fails to recognize it, and slaps a Satanic Crowley sticker on it because it's the only spooky category it knows. So, to wrap up, let's look at what we've actually uncovered when we apply real history and critical theory instead of reactive fear. If you look at the occult mechanics, Izzy uses Aleister Crowley to claim the butt muscle video is an organized, powerful, black magic ritual. But by Crowley's own definition, black practitioners are isolated, selfish egos, incapable of cooperating, an ignorant muddle of dispersions that lacks the structural power to coordinate a systemic, global cultural agenda. If you look at the historical aesthetics, the headless motif in modern avant-garde art doesn't trace back to a Crowleyan invocation for divine authority. No, it traces directly to Georges Bataille's Acéphale and Julia Kristeva's theory of the abject. It is a secular, surrealist tradition designed to step away from the head of societal respectability and force us to confront our raw, somatic, biological reality. When Rick Owens and CHRISTEENE tell us outright that they are engaging in a punk rock, countercultural protest for the sake of queer intimacy and social tolerance, we should take them at their word. This is why the contrast between the artist's reality and Izzy's apparent projection is so incredibly stark. We know from Owens' own interviews that his Catholic education deeply shaped his aesthetic language, and he has explicitly referred to his wife as his guardian angel, a stabilizing, loving presence in his life. Placing her in an angel costume is a deeply personal human reflection of that relationship. Yet, if we look at how Izzy interprets this exact same visual, in his transcript, he claims the imagery is there to destroy and distort the divine. Note the mechanics of the logic here. Because the surrounding aesthetics are jarring and unconventional, the narrative completely discards the artist's personal intent and assumes it must be a literal supernatural desire to uglify the divine. This perfectly mirrors the broader spiritual warfare narratives that we see online. The perspective is often that regardless of what the artists claim they are doing, presenting filth or abjection serves a darker purpose to desensitize the human heart, and that believers have a responsibility to guard against that degradation. That is a deeply held, sincere framework for looking at the world, and it shouldn't be dismissed lightly. But even within a traditional religious framework, there is a vital distinction to be made between a social transgression and a supernatural one. If we look closely at the theological logic, attributing inherent spiritual power to human flesh, sweat, or shock art accidentally gives the material world an authority it simply doesn't have. It suggests that a secular music video can somehow override a person's spiritual standing or distort creation simply by existing. You are entirely allowed to feel shocked or deeply uncomfortable watching this video. In fact, as we established through Kristeva, that visceral response is a natural biological boundary reaction. But experiencing psychological discomfort is not the same as being under a spiritual attack. When we mistake a natural somatic flinch for a coordinated demonic invasion, we miss the actual human conversations the artists are trying to have about empathy, vulnerability, and boundaries. By ignoring the artist's intent, flattening the history of avant-garde philosophy, and misreading the mechanics of the occult, the conspiracy narrative builds a terrifying monster out of terms that actually describe a lack of power, not an abundance of it. Once a narrator convinces their audience that a fashion designer is operating as a high-level occultist, every single aspect of that designer's life becomes fair game for demonic projection. And in the case of Rick Owens, the conspiracy theorists seem to have found their ultimate target by moving away from the runway and now focusing on the women closest to him. In part 4, we're going to step out of the gutter punk world of CHRISTEENE and enter the deeply misunderstood avant-garde world of Owens' partner, Michèle Lamy, and her daughter, Scarlet Rouge. We will look at how the exact same monster-building logic transforms classical myth, family art exhibitions, and ancient archetypes into a horrific narrative of child sacrifice and literal ancient deities. If you've made it this far in the video, I'd like to extend my deepest thanks to you. Every time I start a new part in this series, I am amazed at how deep I am going into these topics. I really appreciate your patience as I work to unravel the proverbial tangled ball of wool. I'll see you next time.